Okay, well, this should be our first podcast. Thanks for being here.
Of course.
So, I want to try to sit like this too. So, then we can actually, because then it's going to come in like this. Okay, so this whole thing began because we started doing our breakfast. And having this group around of being able to have conversations has been fun for all of us. And with me being the youngest one here, it's kind of, no offense,
None
not
taken.
throw you beneath the bus, but so we got into this podcast. I have all the equipment. I have all the stuff. I do photography. And now you're my business coach. So why did you want to be my business coach in the first place? And like, what got you into the point where you could feel like you could coach business?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I had that traumatic injury about 14 or 15 weeks ago, horse accident. So it left me thinking about my life and kind of questioning what am I doing with it. So running a business, which I do now, I work a lot with employees, and employees, I always feel like I'm pulling or pushing them. Like I'm always having to like pull them along. They're not willing participants sometimes. They're being paid and compensated.
But like teenagers.
Yeah, it's like, I'm having to entice them and encourage them and constantly push them along. So coaching, I look at, and this is something, I'm just starting out and trying. So my goal is to coach 5 different people, no cost at all, just for me to get out there and kind of see what it's about and if it's something I'm good at. So, but my thought is, coaching people who are already ambitious is like a tailwind. Right. It should be much easier to coach somebody who has the ambition and wants to do something, and I'm helping them reach their goals.
Right. Well, it's that kind of like pre-selection. So with my business, like I've been told a lot, like, oh, just go and knock on doors and do sales. I hate doing that.
Yeah.
I can't do it.
Yeah.
I won't. I refuse. One time I was on a motorcycle and I went through an affluent part of town. I was like, okay, I'll park my bike and I'll just walk. And I went in, made a loop, and I came out. And I was like, well, not doing that again. And one of the things is when I get calls off of my ads, these people already want the service. They already want the business. And I don't want to make people do anything. I have a service to provide, and I don't want to have to convince someone that there's value to it. Yeah. It's kind of like a relationship where it's like, how valuable do you actually think what you have is, if you feel like you have to convince people to take it.
Right.
So I don't like the cold call sales. I would rather find someone who's already going in that direction, and it's like, okay, here's where I can like not pull you along, but where I can go along with you.
Yeah. Well, there's headwinds and tailwinds. A headwind is like when you're trying to get somebody to do something they don't really want to do. So a lot of employees, I would say the majority of people in life don't ever find what they really want to do. They just kind of randomly toss about until they land somewhere.
Right.
And then people spend their, other people who have a direction, spend their time pushing those people who don't really want to do that anyway, because they've never taken time to find out how they like to spend their time. So working with other people, the tailwind would be, for example, you have all this stuff. You already have it. You kind of are already going in that direction. All it takes is somebody like me to come in and say, here, let me help you. And, it's so much easier working with somebody who's already in that direction. You're already moving that way. I'm not taking an object that's sitting still and trying to put it in motion. I'm just encouraging from behind, not pulling and like prying you to move.
Right, which like for me, that's I I I resist that so much, like trends and like what you should do. It's like people ask me quite often when they first meet me if I served in the armed forces because the haircut, the yes sir, the yes ma'am, the whole homeschooler vibe I have apparently. And I'm like, no, I'm not military material. Some just assume like, oh, you didn't pack the gears to serve in the beloved Corps, to quote Full Metal Jacket. But but I don't know who else my age would quote that. But the thing is, like, I I don't have the wherewithal to when a person tells me go do this, and I'm like, why? Because I said so. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, that's not good enough reason. And it's just like go storm that hill with the machine gun nest. Why? What purpose does that serve? Well, we're supposed to.
Yeah.
Who said we're supposed to?
Yeah.
I would end up in the brig or shot so
Yeah.
fast if I
Yeah.
were in the armed forces where it's just like I don't like doing what I'm supposed to do,
Yeah.
and it frustrates my siblings all to hell because I don't do what I'm supposed to do. I
Yeah.
don't do like the normal stuff that you're just supposed to do, and they think I'm nuts.
I'm the same way, so I relate to you in that because I don't do what everybody thinks people are supposed to do either. So I get where you're coming from for sure.
Right. Well, when we had our breakfast on Thursday, like 3 weeks ago, and you and Jeremy were the last ones here, and then we were discussing about like we're both we're all kind of like comfortable with what we're doing, which for a lot of people that's like what they strive for, and then they wonder why they're unhappy. And when I was like 12 years old, I was reading I don't know if it was I forget what book it was, but it was by a clinical psychotherapist, and he was saying he had a client who came to him and he was like, Doc, I'm miserable, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I've never felt this way, I've always been ambitious and forward thinking and happy, and now I'm depressed. And the doc is like, well, what's happened recently to maybe cause this? And the guy's like, well, that's the issue. My wife is expecting our third child. We have our dream house. I just got the promotion I've always worked for. I've like accomplished everything I want to accomplish, and now I'm miserable. And the doctor's like, well, of course you are. And the guy's like, well, what do you mean, of course I am?
Yeah.
I've done all the stuff I want to do. And the doc's like, no, life is a bicycle. You don't just like get somewhere and you're done. Life's a bicycle you can't get off until you're forced off of it.
Right.
And like, so of course you feel shaky, uncertain, scared because you don't have a direction
You're
now.
not going fast enough.
Right. You aren't going fast enough. You're stalled out. You're trying to do like, oh, I got here. I like it here. I'm going to stay here. No, you're on a bicycle.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And there's such an analogy that made sense. So when you brought up like, I'm looking at coaching, I am looking at this, I enjoy podcasts, and I was like, oh, and I like jumped up. I was like, you two come downstairs, and you both stared at me like, but I still have my coffee. And I was like, no, like come downstairs. And like I brought you guys down here with my setup, and you're like, okay, next week we're talking, we'll set a time, we'll sit down, blah blah blah. And like how it all just like came together like that. Like I know at some point folks are going to be like, oh, you guys got so lucky. Luck is when preparedness meets opportunity, and it's like we're doing all these things that brought it in.
What happened was, I was on my bicycle. I love that analogy. I'm going to use that because you can't put your feet down, right?
Right,
so
right.
if you're going too slow, you're going to have a hard time staying upright.
Right.
So that's where you caught me, was at a spot where I was going real slow because I'm coming out of an injury. I'm questioning my life choices. I'm like, what am I doing? So I'm going real slow. And then what happened was you brought me down here, and I'm like, oh, there's a sweet downhill. Let's go.
Right.
And then just went for it, and that's how we ended up right here.
Right. Well, for me, it's more of like seeing a bike trail that like two twists, and I don't see where it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
And I've done that a lot on a dirt bike where I'm like, oh, there's a trail, let's go. And I come up, and it's like, oh, this is one they blocked off.
Yeah.
Or it's just one that's not used very much, and it's like, oh, this is cool. And that's one of the fun things about being on a motorcycle is that you're not lost until you run out of gas.
Right.
and like that's one of the things
Or
like,
it gets really dark.
or it gets really dark. Yeah, well,
Don't let that happen.
yeah,
We were just
yeah.
talking the other day about how you get down trails sometimes that you don't know where they go, and you can get into some things that you should have a partner for, someone to help you through.
Right.
Yeah.
I've done that before where I've been going down and then down again, and I'm like, that whole thing is shale back up. I can't get back up that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh, it's like 8
Yeah.
o'clock and it's, July, so I have an hour of light left.
Yeah.
I'm just like, but it's not the end of the world because I know, okay, if I have to walk, I know the direction,
Right.
but it sucks. You don't want to have to, but being able to just do that, like, that's one of the things. My mom is like one of the most courageous people I know. And having her as a mama is a burden.
It's terrible.
well, it's just like Ma's a
In a
rad
good way.
chick. Right. Like she's a rad chick, and like there's stuff where it's like folks are like, when I go abroad for like 3 months at a time, like, oh, who'd you go with? Like I was just talking to a client of mine, and she was like, and I shared with her my trip this spring, going a month abroad to Europe and Asia, and she was like, who'd you go with? I was like, no one. I went alone. She's like, you went alone? And like for some people that just blows their mind of where it's like, well, who else am I supposed to know at 31 years old who can just like screw off for a month?
Right.
For one, if they can afford it, it means they're working too hard.
Yeah.
And or they have a wife and kids to take care of. And if they have the time, they can't afford it.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, what else am I supposed to do? Like my mom did stuff like this in her early 20s as a woman in the 70s.
Your mom sounds like a badass, by the way. I need to meet her.
Oh, you would love her. She's a cool chick.
Yeah.
And so to have that, like growing up with these pictures of her on her motorcycles and like hearing her stories, and then when I got into my early 20s and began trying to doing like the same thing, it was like, oh, this takes some like chutzpah, like this takes some cojones.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, it's hard to sit in mediocrity when you're around people who aren't.
Yeah. Exactly.
It sucks. And I'm like, that's one of the things I'm looking forward to doing with this podcast with like you and the rest of our friends, is where I don't want to feel stupid around you guys. Like,
I don't think that would ever happen.
right. Well, true. But, someday I hope I'm as cool as I think I am. But it's like, I'm like, out of the 6 of us, I'm like one of the least successful. I'm also the youngest.
You're the youngest. This is going to say you just need a little bit longer of a time frame.
Right. Well, like that's my hope too, is like having these conversations, especially with someone like you and Jeremy and Cliff. Like I want to, sometimes all it takes is one more idea.
Exactly.
And that's what I'm hoping to get from these conversations, and then sharing them with people, because these conversations that we have every Thursday just around breakfast, they're exceptional.
Yeah.
And it's cool. And plus it's fun to sit and hang out and bullshit with our friends.
So I have one more question going back to what you were talking about before, about traveling alone. Do you think you get more out of traveling alone than with somebody? Like, do you get more out of it?
I think in my early 20s I did. Being able to have those experiences, because it's a lot easier to fit into a group of people as one person instead of trying to fit two. And if I go with a girl, even if it's just a friend, then it's like, oh, they're a couple. And then that some people are then just aren't interested in that. If you're with 2 guys, then it's like, okay, it's too much, but then at the same time it's not enough. Where it's like, if it's just 2 guys, it's like, okay, like, you can't like meet a girl and plan a date when there's 2 of you.
Right.
So going alone, it was great because I could just fit into a lot of groups. Like I was doing a lot of faux pas where I like talk to people on the train and the bus, which like you're not supposed to do.
Yeah.
But
I know, in Europe, right?
Right.
Yeah, Europe's weird because they don't even like look at you when you walk by. They like.
Well,
look down.
well that's because you and I are from small towns where
Right.
like that's normal.
Yeah.
You talk to people, but like when you get into larger places,
Yeah.
more densely populated, then it's like, no, like you mind your own P's and Q's and your own business.
That's so weird to me, though.
It sucks.
I don't like it.
I was chastised by a friend one of my first times in Europe because I would like nod and smile to people on the street.
I did the same thing when I was over there, and they're like, "You're not supposed to
You're
do
not
that," and I'm
supposed
like,
to do that.
"What?
Why not?
Why not?"
It's like, well, they'll all think you're an American tourist.
Well, I am. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this is normal or not, but anytime I do things, I like to do them alone. So I go to a lot of, when I was building the landscaping company, I went to a lot of landscaping events and expos, trade shows, stuff like that. And I always like to go alone because that's how I meet people. If I'm with someone, it's almost like I use them as a crutch.
Right.
And I just cling.
Right.
Instead of getting out and meeting and talking to people. So that's kind of why I asked that, because I think traveling alone for me is I always meet the coolest people. When I travel with Dylan, I just
then you guys are
to Dylan.
your own thing. Right. Yeah. Right. You don't have to. Like, that's one of the things when I travel, one of the things is I'll not pack enough stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'll have to go to the pharmacy to get stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I actually have to go out. And one of the fun and the things, like, even where I spent most of my time was Germany. Perfectly fluent. But I would talk to people in English first, because enough people speak English, especially the youngsters, that it was fine. And then I just started to incorporate German, and it was fine. Or if they didn't speak English, then I just speak to them in German. But the thing was, just speaking to them in English and asking for help. Hey, does this train? Because I'm an American. I don't take public transportation.
You are such an American.
Right. And so it was like, so I was so unaccustomed to it because it always just shows the original stop and the last stop. And I'm like, okay, does this stop somewhere between? Like, am I on the right platform? And, just from that, and they'll be like, oh, where are you off to? Like, what's your final destination? Or where are you from? Are you an American? And I'm like, oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And then I'll start throwing in German. And some are like, oh, wait, do you speak that? And I was like, oh, yeah. And they're like, oh, okay. And it's not really an issue for them, but just speaking in English and asking the questions, like, he's not from here, he needs some help, that's why he's asking me a question, and it completely drops that shield because it takes them a little while speaking to me in German to realize I'm not a native speaker. So then they're like, okay, why are you talking to me? We're both Germans. Like, what do you want? Yeah. And I'm like, no, I'm an American. I need some help. Like, oh, bless you. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Grüß Gott. Yeah, so doing all of that to make it not so simple is one of the best things we can do. And part of doing these things that I'm doing now, including this pod, is I want to make life a little less easy. Right. It sounds, I don't want to sound like the entitled, spoiled douche, because it's not that. It's just, I need, God, both of these sound so wild to say, but it's like having a little bit more challenge, having a little bit more unknown, not knowing what to expect as much. Like, some people think that's the goal is, safety and security. It's all illusion. It's all nonsense. So to embrace that, it's a bit like going to the gym. Like, you're doing something you don't necessarily have to do to survive, but you're embracing the suck in order to get more enjoyment. Yeah.
Well, I think it might have been you that's talking about we do our best work, we do our best, we perform the best as humans when we are at the edge of our comfort zone. So where we're doing things that we don't quite know how to do, that's where we feel the best and perform the best. Right. Is right on that edge of like, I know what I'm doing and then I don't know what I'm doing. So,
Chaos and
yes.
or chaos
Yeah.
and and
And that's
order.
yeah, and that's what makes life exciting too. So the opposite thing of how did this go? I'm gonna mess this up because this is how I do things.
We find our way as we go along.
So anyway, the whole point is I don't remember the saying, but the whole point is that boredom is what causes unhappiness. That's it. The opposite of happy isn't unhappy. The opposite of happy is boredom.
Right.
Boredom is what causes people to be unhappy.
Yeah, and my mom, when I came to her one time, like I was so bored that I came to my mama asking what to do, and like that was a bad thing because there was always stuff to do, and but I just had no idea what to do. Was that I was actually at that point where I was willing to ask my mom. I think I was a preteen,
Yeah.
and it may have been like 10, and I said a thing that I knew I shouldn't, but I was looking for a reaction, and I came up and Mom was in her office and said, "Hey, Mama," and she, because it was always get her attention, and then she'd say, "Yes, dear," or, and she said, "Yes, son." I said, "I'm bored. What can I do?" And she gets done on her computer, and she's like, looks at me. And then she goes back to what she's doing, and she types and she stops and goes, "Son, intelligent people are never bored." And then goes back to her work. Like, that was it. And I was like, did she just call me stupid? I was like, oh, well, I guess I'd best find thing to do.
Yeah.
And the last time I remember being bored, I was 16 years old, and it lasted about 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the worst 15 minutes of my life.
Yeah.
And I've been on horrible dates.
Yeah.
And that was still just like, oh my God, this is awful. And that was the last time I remember being bored.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things that I go back to. I don't know why it stuck so much, but that idea of like intelligent people are never bored. It's like it made sense to me somehow.
It does. It makes sense to me, and I think you flipped it real quick because you started with, "Did she call me stupid?" But then you're like, "I better find something to do."
Right.
But you took that extra step because some people would be like, "Did she just call me stupid?" and walk away offended and be like, "Whatever." But you didn't. You took it the way that it was intended to be taken, of like, "Oh, well, I don't want to. I want to be intelligent, so I'm going to go find something to do."
Right.
And you probably carry it with you to this day to where you just find stuff to do.
Right. And like that's one of the things, like I feel like it's so weird. Like we talked a while ago about like the paradoxes I've been experiencing in this life the last 2 weeks or so. And like one of the things is like I don't think like shame and guilt is useful coming from other people.
Mm-hmm.
Like in relationships I've had, if it's been professional or personal, when I realize someone's trying to shame and guilt me, I'm like, oh, you're trying to manipulate me.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been times with people I look up to, like Cliff, where he's like an ersatz dad to me, and I'm like ashamed to tell him a thing, and like I've been like worried that he'll like shame me or guilt me. He never has. Like there have been times where he's like, "Oh, did you do that thing you talked about doing?" And I'm like, "No," and he's like, "Okay."
Yeah.
And it's not like, "You rat bastard, you should have." It's not like that, but I know that he's not like disappointed, because it's not like, because he has like faith and trust in me, but at the same time it's like, okay, well, we both know you should have.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll get there at some point. It's too bad it's not yet, because it's a bit like that, but it's in like a friend way. It's not in like a dad to a son way. It's in like a friend way of like, okay, I know you can do better. And like the reason I'm ashamed to tell him, or I feel guilt about that, is because I know I can do better too. And so in that regard, like the shame and guilt, not feeling good, being dissatisfied, being uncomfortable, just because they make us feel bad doesn't mean they're bad. Where it's like, I experience shame and being abashed when, like, I would be too ashamed to tell someone I'm bored.
Right.
I would feel shame. Like, I would feel shame to tell my girlfriend, how rough life is right now. Like, I'd feel shame about that, where it's like, that's not what I do.
Yeah.
And my mom would do that. Like, she had that old fashioned way of, like, your last name, like your ancestors. It's like, that's one of the things. My grandpa, my mom's dad, was farmed out during the Great Depression. Like, there were people who went through hardship.
Yeah.
And, like, here I'm complaining for whatever reason. And then it's like, how can I? Like, my ancestors survived so much for me to be born, where it's just such exponential the amount of people who all had to make it work for me to exist in the first place.
Yeah.
And they had to survive the Inquisition and the plague and the Crusades and the 700 years of the Irish being enslaved. It's like, you guys survived all that, so
Yeah.
I could be born, and all I can do is complain about how hard it is to finance a house and support kids.
And that's the thing, too, is it's almost become too easy. Like,
right.
People are unhappy because we have too much time to think about how unhappy we are.
We don't have enough problems.
Yeah, well, there's too much time, so all we do is just sit and think about the things we could have or should have or would have.
We're made to solve problems. And when we're unhappy, and like, that's what we were talking about, this comfort that we've reached with our lives is where it's like, I don't have enough problems. And then if you're unhealthy, you go and you gamble, you wench, you do dumb stuff, you self-destruct just so like these cliche TV series lines where it's like, I just want to feel something but girl, like, you have a house, you have a husband who loves you, you have kids, you have all this stuff, and you're unhappy. It's like, right, because you don't actually have enough problems, so you then find really bad problems, and now you have a problem. And, like, people don't realize they're not trying to be happy. They're looking for accomplishment, they're looking to solve things, they're looking for a righteous struggle, and through that they find happiness and joy.
So back to the opposite of unhappy, or the opposite of happiness is boredom. So flipping that back around, what is happiness? Happiness is being excited about something or having excitement. How can you be excited and unhappy?
Yes.
You can?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me.
So the whole reason, the thing is, like, I get your point, but I don't think it's the whole point.
Okay.
So when I experience happiness is when I have a sense of accomplishment. Is when, like, I feel like, it's a bit like getting to the top of a mountain where it's like, oh, great. And that's the reason why happiness is so fleeting, is because it's a peak. And then it's like, okay, what's the next problem to solve? For me, this is how I see it, at least, where I can experience joy, and what brings me joy is gratitude. And what brings me gratitude is a sense of being blessed.
Yeah.
And there are times where I have to remind myself of how I've been blessed, because I've been so lucky. And instead of it being this thing of like, oh, I was so lucky, I'm special, I'm blessed, I'm this and that, instead of making that thing to allow me to feel hubris, what helps me, like, stay grounded is recognizing that I didn't do this alone.
Yeah.
Like, this whole thing, like, even with people where I don't believe them when they say it, where ain't nobody did nothing for me, and don't mind the terrible grammar of that whole sentence, but that whole thing of, like, I did this all on my own. No, you didn't. You still used systems that other people set up.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'll get it all worked out as we go along, I swear.
Okay, so question, what's my metric for success?
Right.
I think what we were talking about earlier of being joyful during the steps and during the process would be success. And that's how I've shifted my brain from like achieving this one thing to now I don't have like a set like I'm successful when I do this anymore.
Right.
I broke it down into days, so now I have two things. I stole this from Tim Ferriss, but two things that if I do those two things today, it's a successful day. Because then it shortens my feedback loop. It's not a year-long feedback loop. It's
Right.
every day I get a feedback of like, you had a successful day or you didn't. And if you don't, it's fine. Just move on. Just don't let too many of those happen in a row. But so now, I set my 3-year goal, where I want to be in 3 years, what I want my life to look like. So my big thing is I want to travel and I want to have freedom to travel, but still earn an income and make money. So it's where helping you with this podcast, starting my blog, that kind of stuff happened. And that's, a long-term goal. And then I break that down into daily steps and the daily activities I have to do. So it's still those steps, but
Right.
I've realigned into doing things that don't go against my inherent like character or personality or whatever.
It won't break things that won't break your own rules.
And so now success to me is like living each day. Like I can gauge my success at the end of every day.
Nice.
Like where am I at? What did I do? And making sure I'm taking enough time. So the reason I only choose 2 things every day is because I could overload myself real easy. I'm a doer. I'm like, if I focus on that end goal, I just do so many steps. I do as many as I can every single day. And then I'm exhausted.
And plus you set all these goals that you don't always hit.
Yes.
And then you feel like you failed because you didn't hit all your metrics.
And it's just a big rush to get there because I want the reward.
Right.
So that's where breaking it down into, okay, 2 things every day that I need to do. Honestly, each 2 things, like I'm usually done with my 2 things by 9 a.m. every morning. And then I spend the rest of the day, okay, what do I want to do?
Right.
And sometimes it's, my mom's 83, so sometimes it's spending time with my mom, going and having coffee with her. Sometimes it's going and doing something with Dylan. Sometimes it's organizing my bookshelf. But get those 2 things done that get me closer to my goal, my long-term goal. And I can feel happy because I'm like, I got these 2 things done. I'm doing good.
You have a sense of accomplishment.
Yep. And then I can free my brain up and I don't feel guilty for not doing more. Because that's when you have a goal in the distance, it's easy to be like, oh, I could have done more today. I could have done more.
I could have gone further.
Could have gone further.
Right.
But because I've set it up like to be in a marathon and not a sprint anymore, because living life in a sprint, you hate life, and then you get to the end, you're like, yes, and then you do it all over again.
Right.
So having that marathon mentality where, I did my 2 things, now I can spend time doing what I want to do, because that's what people start businesses for in the first place, is to have freedom to do what they want to do. So
right.
Once those 2 things are done, I am free for the rest of the day to do whatever I want to do. And sometimes it is a couple extra things toward my goal. If Dylan doesn't have something going on that he wants me to do, or if my mom's busy, like there's not a friend to spend time with, I'll keep working.
Right.
Because that's my natural default.
Right.
But I free myself up to be able to spend time with people, because really spending time with people is what brings you joy.
It brings you juice. Oh yeah.
So
right.
You're not burning yourself out, because I've burned myself out. Like the last 8 years building a business, I burned myself out, and I realized this is not the life that I wanted to live. So I've rearranged it.
Right.
And I'm living differently in the moment, and I may not be as successful as quickly as other people, but I'm gonna be damn happy while I'm doing it.
Right. Like that's one of those things where like one of the things I have to remind myself is where I feel so behind the 8 ball on some things, because I come across these guys who are like, they're 32 years old and they have a real estate portfolio of 250 million. I'm like, son of a bitch, but compared to where I was, I'm like, okay, I've come a long ways. Like
Yeah.
I have actual measurable success that I've achieved personally. And the whole reason we were home birthed and homeschooled and, born and raised outside of the matrix was my mama had always said she didn't want us to be just another cog in the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my mother is such a staunch individualist where sometimes to a fault, where I say that because I see it in my own self, where it's like I had the hardest time liking the Barbie movie because I didn't feel like I was supposed to because there's such a freaking trend. I'm like, oh my God, I'm
Right.
one of the normies. But the way I saw it, of where it's like, oh, I actually think this is it's not a extremist propaganda film packed into a kid's movie. I think it's actually a really conservative movie that's actually wrapped in like, oh, this is all mainstream and PC and blah blah blah.
So
And I'm
first
like,
of all, you watched the Barbie movie.
loved it. Loved it. Absolutely loved it.
Okay.
I bought the shirt where it says I am Knuff.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's great.
I'll have to watch it.
It is awesome. I'm going to watch it with my best friend, and
Okay.
he's already resenting me for it.
Okay.
But because he's my best friend,
That's
he'll do
funny.
it. But so, like, there are things where I'm like, no, like, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And that's fine if it's a part of a trend. But growing up, where mom was like, I don't want you guys to be another cog in the wheel.
Yeah.
She didn't want to be one. I didn't want to be one, and she didn't want us to be one. And going into, because this whole metric of success and what it is we're doing, I didn't want to be another cog in the wheel. So that discomfort that you said you began to feel of like, I don't want to keep going like this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this whole pop side of like, oh, always be happy and joyful and blah blah blah, I don't buy it. For one, being happy is not a worthwhile goal. Like, of just like, for me, being happy is like when I think of like, okay, what would I be doing like on an ideal vacation? It involves like the beach, the tropics, a hot girl, like that's fun. But I know it's fun for a weekend or a week. And then it's
Yeah.
like, okay, let's get back to work. Because, like, with you, my kind of default is work, too.
Yeah.
I'm miserable when I'm not working,
Me
which
too.
is why I have to, like, find stuff to do. And what you hit recently is what I hit when I was 22 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was sick of my job. I was sick of the trajectory of my life where it felt like I was mortgaging the now in the hopes of a good future where like, okay, I can be happy then.
Mm-hmm.
And there was forgot his name. I'll have to find it because there's very good. He kept talking about things that are unhealthy, and the host was like, well, what do you mean by unhealthy? And the guest said, that which is unsustainable is unhealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was 22, I had what I called my eighth of a life crisis. Because there's not a midlife crisis. There was like, I felt like I was like, okay, I have to do all this. I have to sacrifice all of this. And that's one of, again, with the paradoxes, that's one of the things that makes you successful is the fact that you can delay your gratification
Mm-hmm.
in order to achieve something more later on. It's a sacrificing of the now for a better future. But if you don't have a future that excites you, then you're just in the grind.
And that one I struggle with too. I struggle with this whole like life should be pain type of mentality, or the delayed gratification. Because like I said, I'm a short feedback loop person anyway.
Right.
I like gratification.
Right.
But
But you're willing to work for it.
I'm willing to work for it. But that's
Right.
the thing is like, I knew from the time I was 19, I'm going to own a business. Like, I was like, that's what I'm doing.
I'm not a good employee.
Yeah, like, I
Right.
just never could. I've never been an employee, really. I was a barista where I worked by myself in a coffee stand, and it was like my own little business. I worked for tips, and nobody was there telling me what to do. But I've never actually had a quote-unquote real job.
Right.
So at 19, I was like, I just knew I was going to own a business, and that's what I've spent the last how many years has that been? I don't know. It's been like a while. 17 years. So 17 years working on having this business, which that's when I realized, like, oh, you don't just start a business, have a business, and own a business. Like, it's a continuous growing of this business forever and ever and ever and ever. It's not like you get there and like, oh, I achieved this status. Like, it's a continuation. So that's where I had to, because I never stopped to think about it. I just was on this path. Like, I knew where I was going. That's where I'm going. I was just on this path for the last 17 years. And then that's what I mean. I got there 8 years ago. And for 8 years, I've been just grinding. And I'm like, okay, this is not what I had in mind when I was 19.
Right.
So knowing now that it's not the status of business ownership where you're like, oh, I'm a business owner and life's happy and I've got money and I can travel. Because, yes, I have all that stuff. But there's also this other aspect of like, no, you have a business. Like,
Yeah,
that's a lot of responsibility.
It is a baby.
Yes.
Right.
And that's where I realized, okay, back up. It's not about just having a business and owning a business. Like, I need to align myself with that business so that I can continue to do it. Or, this idea of serial entrepreneurship where I tend to be that person that gets bored with things. Where I'm like, okay, this is the same thing day in, day out. I just can't do this wheel. It's just this reoccurring thing. So, I may be that type of person that I could be happy starting a business, building it, getting it running, and selling it, and moving on to a new one. That's still in my, like, maybe that's what I need to do thought process. Or I find something that I can do for the rest of my life and not feel like it's a grind every day.
Right.
Like, it's not going to be all easy or all happy or, that, but it's something that something that aligns with who I am, that I can continue to do for the long term.
Well, what about this? So, instead of it being a long-term, like, okay, what's the thing I can do for the rest of my life? That sounds like a public schooler idea. So where it's like, okay, you have to like pick this thing and then just stick with it. It's like, no, that may have been how it worked in the 40s, but like, what about a thing you can enjoy doing for 5 years? Like, what do you think about that? Where it's like, what's a career path, business idea, investment that I can do where I can enjoy it for 3 or 5 years, and then if I enjoy it, I can keep going, or I can go like, okay, I'm done. Because the reason I say that is because it's kind of like, I didn't think I would get into window cleaning. Like, no kid grows up and like pretends to be a window cleaner, wants his parents to buy him toy squeegees. It's like, I wanted to be a fireman or a cowboy. Like those were cool. And when I was into street motorcycles, I've done like 65,000 miles on street bikes, coast to coast, border to border. I've done all that. And I kind of don't enjoy it now.
Right.
And it's like, you know what, that's fine. I like the dirt bikes. And I kind of sucked the juice out of it. And that was one of the best pieces of advice that Cliff gave me when I was young, was just like, if you enjoy it now, strike while the iron's hot. Just suck all the juice out of it that you can, because there may come a point where you just don't. He said, and at the time I couldn't imagine me not enjoying bikes. But I knew it was possible. I knew what he was saying was true. And that was one of the things when, again, with traveling, like, why do you do this when you're going alone? It's like, well, one, it's either go alone or not go at all. And one of the things was, with being so invested in being a husband and a father in the future, I was like, there are some things I just won't be able to do, so I'd better do it now, and I'd better find a way. So there was a lot I sacrificed in order to do all that. Like, one of the things that drives some of my siblings nuts is the fact that a bunch of them went to school or got married, and then they built their life from there. And then one having a midlife crisis now, and she's wrecking her life, poor thing. And then one is married, and if she's not having some of these same things going on right now, she will. And I kind of went through all that first, where they like built their career, their life, their this and that, and then they're going to. There's a fly in here. Awful. At some point, they're going to have to hit that
Yeah.
mode where they then have to deal with themselves. I dealt with myself, began to in my early 20s, and where I hit that point where I was like, this is unsustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm at a point where I'm like trying to build my actual like life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like I feel like I got it out of the way, but I do feel like I accomplished a lot of things, because I could have, built up and done all these things, and then it's like, it's that idea we have, like, oh, I'll like work, grind, and then I can like coast. You can't.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just rest on your laurels. And I didn't want to end up like that, of where like, okay, I have all this stuff and I'm miserable. I can't mortgage the now for tomorrow. So I have to find a way to do this now.
Yeah.
And enjoy this now and suck the juice out of it, because at some point I won't enjoy it.
Yeah.
And or I won't be able to do it because of other life obligations. For everything there is a time, there is a season. And if your next season is where it's like, okay, trying to find a thing I can do for the rest of my life, you can have that in mind, but if you don't know what to do, one of the best things is just do something.
And that was kind of my, serial entrepreneurship thing, was that would be me doing different things
Right.
for the rest of my life.
Right. All the time.
All the time.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
And it comes back to the short feedback loop I have, which I don't know if there's a way to change that feedback loop cycle or what I'm tolerant of, but it's a short feedback loop for me is once you have an established business, the feedback loop gets a lot longer.
Mm.
Like, it's basically at the end of the year, how'd I do? How'd the business do? It's not a daily, like, how did I do? And
we survived. Yes. Success.
And that's too long of a distance for me personally,
right,
to not be confirmed that I'm going the right direction, and I feel uncomfortable and I don't like it. It's just a daily grind to me. And that's why startups are exciting to me, because this is what I need to do to take this step, and it's instant progress. Like, it's leaps and bounds, quick growth.
Right.
Like, I'm seeing it, it's happening, we're doing this.
Right.
It's just obvious.
Right.
And when it's an established business, it's not. It's like, here we are again, another client that did this or that wants that, or that it's the same thing as yesterday,
Right.
It's,
yeah. It becomes predictable.
Yes.
And walking that edge of order and chaos is what you can do and what you can't do, but chaos is unlimited potential.
Mm-hmm.
And so, did you know it was actually like a Catholic priest who came up with the idea of the Big Bang?
No.
Yeah. So like now it is like just canon in science, the Big Bang. There were a lot of people who were so opposed to it because like, that's a miracle. And now the scientists are like, oh yeah, there was a Big Bang. And like, it's kind of a thing where they're like, well, I can explain to you all just the evolution and the primordial soup and the blah, blah, blah. But you need to give me the first miracle of the Big Bang. And then we'll go from there. And the whole thing about the Big Bang is when you read Genesis, and I'm not a scholar, but it's like, there was chaos, there was darkness, there was chaos. Chaos is unlimited potential. And in the beginning there was the Word. And for me, the Word is consciousness. It is thought. It is the spiritual direction that orders chaos. And with these conversations, when we have thoughts, there's unlimited potential in our world and in our lives. And then when we have a thought where it can then grasp onto that chaos and order it, that's in the active act of creation.
Right.
Is bringing you bring the light. Light is consciousness. We are enlightened when we become more conscious.
Yeah.
All those phrases come into play. And for me, when I think back to the most fun I had with my work was the first 3 years. I'm now in the 6th year.
Yeah.
And the first 3 years of where it's like the unknown of, am I going to eat next week?
Right.
And that was a literal thing where
Yeah.
where I lived, I was renting. I would work for $10 an hour for the gal who owned the property, and I would work off my rent some months.
Yeah.
And it sucked at the time, kind of, but like looking back, it's sort of like, oh, that was fun. Like I would get calls from prospective clients who would want a bid, and I'd say, yeah, I can come out in a day or two. I'll give you a bid. And they're like, okay, well, when can you get to it? And I'll say, oh, 2 weeks. I could have gone to it that day, but I just knew from having to flirt with women that you can't be too available, where it's like, if you're too available, no one wants you.
Right.
And then it's like, okay, if no one wants you, why would I want you?
Right.
And so I would like do that where I was like, oh, it's 2 weeks out. I was like, but I need to eat. And I was like, okay, I have a job in 2 days. It'll pay me like $250.
Yeah.
I can get my groceries then.
Yeah.
And there's one of those things where I look back and like that's one of the things is that I want that for my kids too.
Yeah.
And I want them to be able to recognize that, the way is the way. Like the point of doing it is the doing. And I have a brother where he doesn't get that idea at all. It just drives him nuts where it's like it has nothing to do with the space between point A and point B. It's all about getting to point B. And he's a mathematician and an engineer. And thank God we have people like that building our bridges. It's just we have a really hard time communicating because he's so focused on the end result, whereas I'm focused on the enjoyment of the process, which is one of the reasons why he doesn't get the point of a motorcycle at all. He does not even enjoy cars.
Right.
Like he like doesn't see the point of enjoying the car because it's just a vehicle literally to get from point A to point B, and that's all it is for him. Whereas a bike is entirely predicated on enjoying the space between point A and point B. And I really hate the word goals because like this whole stuff of like set goals and crush them, and I'm like, oh my God, like it's like so obnoxious to me. I can't stand that.
So what would you prefer in place of that?
Well, I was talking to Cliff some months ago, and I will realize I like the word objective. Because, growing up around military people and also playing copious amounts of video games, there were always these objectives.
Yeah.
You had to hit all these objectives, and they were the goals towards, like, the big goal. And it's like, when I'm like, oh, okay, if I don't have, like, a lifelong goal per se, which I'm still looking for because I think that's important to have, but if I can get the objectives along the way, it's like, oh, I can hit these objectives like you with your 2 things a day, where it's like, those are the objectives.
Yeah.
If the objectives are checked off, success.
Right.
And having that as a metric of success of like accomplishing objectives along the way where the objectives as a whole are the goal instead of like a goal that's like ethereal and out there and it's uncertain. It's like, I don't like that. It sucks. I hate the word goal just because it's so overused.
That's interesting.
And it's a good word and all of that, but I just have such a...
Yeah.
Like when I hear people talk about, oh yeah, go out and set your goals and blah, I'm like, oh God. I would rather, it like makes me want to just like rip off my arms so I have someone to throw at them.
That's good to know.
I'm just like, this is awful stuff. Because it just seems so vapid and superficial.
Yeah.
And like, there are times where I hear people talk about it, like Cliff, like he'll talk about goals.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, like that I can get on
Yep.
board with. But when it's like some of these people who are like, yeah, goals, crush
Right.
them, slay, I'm like, no,
Right.
I like, it's a shortcoming of mine, but it's one of those things where I recognize it, where I'm like, okay, I don't like to set goals. What can I set? And I thought about it for months. Then I came up like, oh, objectives.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. And it may sound so stupid and like semantics, but it's important in knowing how to talk to ourselves and knowing what the metric is. And it's like, okay, then we can set up that metric. Metrics of success. I had listened to a Tony Robbins thing when I was young, and he talked about how, there we go, how about success. And it was the first time I'd thought about success like that. I was like, oh, 12, 13. And about how he was in a group of businessmen, and one guy was saying, oh yeah, I'm not that successful yet because, we haven't hit our metric of like 50 million or something like that. And then one more guy was like, well, I'm successful because I'm not 6 feet under yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, like that can be a metric for success. And this was before I even knew the term metric of success. Yeah. And there was a story then that broke my heart where, well, not broke my heart, there's another story out of that, but this was like really striking to me, was the band Metallica, right before they got signed, they kicked out like their bassist. Like they came into the tour bus, woke him up, all of his stuff. They're like, GTFO.
Right.
I forget if it's like a bassist or whatever he was. And he then made a promise to himself. He's like, I'm going to be more successful than them and screw them and blah, 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 blah. And he formed the band Megadeth.
Okay.
And they're one of the best selling, most successful metal bands in the world.
Yeah.
But they're not as popular as Metallica.
Right.
And he did an interview some years ago, like 10 years ago. I think he was like 50. And he's talking about all of his multi-platinum, multiple albums, all this stuff. And like, how does this make you feel being so popular and like so successful? Like, what's that like for you? And, now that you're this age. And he starts crying. He's like, I feel like such a failure. He's like, because I'm not as successful as Metallica. Right. And I'm like, son of a bitch, you're number 2.
Right.
But like, he didn't hit his goal.
Yeah.
Like, his metric of success was unsuccessful. It was like unproductive. And it's like, bro,
yeah.
like, and he's just miserable. He's one of the most successful people in history of his profession. And he feels like he's completely failed in life because he didn't hit that metric. And it's like,
and that's a problem in life. Like, that is a problem.
Right.
Like, because I've seen it happen to a lot of people who are super successful, but they're not. I'm going to use Hillary Clinton as an example because she always wanted to be president. And she wanted to be president really bad.
Oh, she did everything.
But like, she's never going to be president.
Right. Right.
So, she's someone, I don't feel bad for her, but, she's someone that I'm like, oh boy, when she lost that last one she ran for, I'm like, she's never going to achieve that goal. She's never going to feel successful in her whole life.
Right.
And, there's a lot of people like that, oh, man, that's the goal. And if they don't do it, they're never, and I don't know, I guess that's where you got to be careful a little bit because my whole objective was always to be a business owner. And I'm like, man, I've been a business owner since the day I decided I was going to be a business owner. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I guess, some people are like, oh, I want to be a billionaire. I'm like, I don't care to be a billionaire. If I reach that status, great. But it's
once you hit about 10 mil, it's like, but after that, it's like,
there's a point where you make so much money that no amount of money is going to change your life because you already have it. And,
right.
to set that billionaire goal, like if I did that, I'm basically chaining myself to something that if I don't achieve it, I'll die unsuccessful.
Right. And it's like,
And it's not worth it. So, like, you want to have big ideas and objectives, but you don't want to have something that, like, you're going to feel like a failure in life if you don't reach it when you're not a failure.
And you don't set yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
Well, there was, it's so weird because, like, people who are successful in life, as in where, they're financially stable, they're not home, successful is you're not homeless.
Mm-hmm.
You have a job, like in the United States, if you make like 30 or 35,000 a year, you're in the top 1% wealthiest people in the world.
That's insane.
It's absolutely nuts. And it's just, here we feel so unsuccessful because here we're in like the not we, I mean, the average person, it's all relative of where it's like, the projects, all the government housing is like 50% larger than the average apartment in Europe.
Yeah.
And you know what it costs to have an apartment in Europe? It's like, and it's just like, and, the poorest people, the bottom 10% of people in America have more creature comforts and luxury than kings 150 years ago.
So I can't necessarily speak for other countries, but I think Americans have made the mistake of putting money on a pedestal. Like, everybody's gauging success by how much money you make or how much money you have.
Right.
Why is that? That's not how it should be.
Right. I think you're right. And also, I think it's because of a poor relationship with money. I don't think that's necessarily wrong to do it that way, because one of the things that I enjoy about that fact, though, is that using it as a metric, because you can't fake what's in your bank account.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it's one of those things where it's like, when I would look at my life when I had very little perspective, where I had less perspective than I do, I still think I have little perspective, but where it's like, I could look at my bank account and I would realize I had too much month at the end of my paycheck. It's like, oh, that's a concrete metric that I can go by. I have these expenses, I have this income. How can I adjust those things? And so it's helpful, but it's not the end all be all. It's a tool.
Mm-hmm.
It is one of the things by which you can gauge your success. Like, that's one of the things is where it's like, I went to check out the new Toyota Tundra yesterday. I've been seeing them on the road. I'm like, those are a sexy truck.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a Ford guy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, oh, that's a sexy truck. And I like Toyota. I like Japanese brands.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, that's a nice truck. I like that. I went and checked it out. And the salesman who came up to me was about my age. Tall, good-looking guy. Had a Vandals thing on his polo. And like, big, husky, tall, dark, and handsome guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he was chubby. Just like soft all over. Like, looked like he had been athletic when he was young.
Yeah.
He may have been one of the Vandals. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it was like, it was one of those things where it's like, I don't think we can be friends.
Mm-hmm.
Of where it's like, who knows? He may be a successful salesman. He may be all the things. He was fine.
Yeah.
He was kind of milquetoast, but he was fine. But it was a bit like where it's like, I like looked at his card, and this may sound so terrible, but I threw it away. And I was like, I don't trust a fat car salesman.
Right.
Because it's just one of those things you can't fake.
Yeah.
Like, you can't fake not being fat.
Right.
And, you can't fake what's in your bank account. And if you do, it's all on debt, and you can just fake it for so long, and you actually make things worse. So having that on like just a pedestal, when people make it the metric of success instead of a factor in success, then that's where I think people go wrong. It's where they're like, as long as one thing is in order in my life, then my whole life is okay. It's like, maybe, but I think you're kind of fooling yourself. Of where it's like, that's where an unsophisticated person would look at someone like you or me and be like, why do you guys feel unsatisfied? Why are you unhappy? I'd love to be where you are.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, because you're looking at the one metric.
Yeah.
For us, we need the other metric of, not being bored.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, there are two types of people who, what they do when they get bored. Some self-destruct, some find creative, some think of things to do.
Yeah.
Like, those are the two things. And I think that's why my mom said intelligent people are never bored, is because thinking people are thinking of things to do, and actually things they want to do, instead of just doing what they have to do.
Right.
And then for people like us to work around people who work for us who don't do that, where it's like, don't you see the opportunity here?
Yeah.
Of where it's like, this is what you can do, like, and instead they're just like, well, here I am, we'll see what happens. And it's like, it sucks to live that way.
Yeah.
It blows.
Some people, I guess, like it, because if they didn't like it, why would they keep doing it?
Right. Well, some people are just masochistic.
Yeah.
Like, they enjoy that suffering. Because
I'll never understand.
Well, it's the known. If they're in the known and they know what to expect, that's where they find comfort, even if they expect misery the next day.
Yeah.
And it's so wild, and it's gross, and it's sad.
Yeah.
But some people's kids, man. Well, I think this was a good conversation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I even had a couple aha moments myself.
Oh, good. Well, it was fun being fun. It's been fun to be able to just like bounce ideas and being able to disagree with someone without being disagreeable, and also knowing that if you disagree with me or I disagree with you, it's not because we're disagreeing with each other as people. It's because we're trying to expand on an idea or have a nuanced view, instead of just, well, I don't think you're right. I have no idea why, but, screw you and the horse you rode in on.
The best conversations are one where there are disagreements, because that's where you actually stretch your brain to think.
Right. Yeah. Right. And when we lose track of time, and we've been doing this for almost an hour and a half, and you were here for a half hour before. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
I sure enjoyed this, and we'll have to be doing it again.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks.